First, a tribute to the photographers who made the images you're going to see. Here's the studio of W.H. Jacoby of Minneapolis. You can see the big windows and skylight with louvers above to regulate the light. And there's a guy on a balcony using a solar enlarger. And here's the St. Paul photographer William Illingworth with his family in front of Minnehaha Falls. Here's a tighter crop. I believe William Illingworth is the man on our right. In addition to his work in St. Paul, he photographed Fisk's Montana expedition and Custer's Black Hills one. How about some prehistory? People of the Mississippian mound-building culture built hundreds of mounds in the Twin Cities area. 6 which have survived are in Mounds Park in St. Paul, and they're about 2,000 years old. People don't climb on them anymore. Indian mounds often overlook water, and these overlook the Mississippi, a view enjoyed by this natty gentleman of 1903. The Indians around here were, and are, mostly Dakota, or Sioux, and Ojibwe, or Chippewa. The cities and the state still have a substantial native population. Here are a few photos of scenes of Indian life in the mid-19th century. The fur trade followed the arrival of European Americans fairly quickly. Red River carts were used in the fur trade between St. Paul and Pembina, in present-day North Dakota, starting around 1801. They were built by the Métis and country-born, people of mixed native and European ancestry, out of natural materials with no iron. They began to disappear in the 1870s as the railways were built out. After the War of 1812, the government built a string of forts in what was then the Northwest, including Fort Snelling in what would become Minnesota. While building the fort in 1820, the soldiers lived near what they dubbed Coldwater Spring. The spring still flows, and the spring house is still there, but without the roof. The oldest structure in Minnesota, apart from Indian mounds, is the round tower at Fort Snelling. You can see how it has been altered over the years, with crenellations and bigger windows. Those have been filled in when it was restored. Here's the hexagonal tower. Much could be said about the history of Fort Snelling, but one thing with national implications is that Dred Scott and his wife Harriet were enslaved there in the late 1830s. It was nominally free territory, but army officers were allowed to bring enslaved servants with them when they were posted here. The Scotts later sued for their freedom, arguing in part that they had lived on free soil at Fort Snelling. They lost in the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Dred Scott decision helped push the nation toward the Civil War. You're looking at what was arguably the birthplace of St. Paul. Fountain Cave had a spring in it, perfect for brewing and distilling, and Pierre Pig's Eye Perron saw a business opportunity. The community that grew up around the still became known as Pig's Eye. When Father Lucien Gaultier came to town, he didn't like the name and suggested St. Paul. In 1862, while the Civil War raged in the East, war broke out in Minnesota between Anglo-Americans and the Dakota. There's much more to be said about the war, but we'll confine ourselves to a few stereos. Astonishingly, there's a stereo taken during the war of whites on the prairie fleeing the war. After the war's end, 1,600 Dakota women, children, and old men were crowded into a small stockade on Pike Island, where they were poorly fed, and over the winter somewhere between 130 and 300 of them died of disease. 2 Dakota men helped hundreds of Dakota escape to Canada, but they were wanted for their part in the war. 2 years after the war, they were found, drugged, captured, and returned to the U.S. They were tried by a military tribunal and hanged together at Fort Snelling on November 11, 1865. One was Shakopee, or Little Six. The town of Shakopee is named for his father. You can see the stone walls of the fort behind him. The other was Wakano Zanzan, or Medicine Bottle. The Falls of St. Anthony are the only major natural waterfall on the Mississippi. It's been argued that the falls are responsible for the location of the Twin Cities. They eroded the limestone riverbed upstream of St. Paul, leaving scattered blocks of stone that made it hard to reliably get a steamboat upstream of St. Paul, making it the head of navigation. The falls provided water power for sawmills and flour mills in what became Minneapolis. In the early days, the falls were in a pretty natural state, but tunnels and other changes accelerated erosion, and the falls were in danger of collapse by 1866. Aprons were built to prevent this, and the current concrete one was completed in 1952. These are the voyages of the steamboat Enterprise, here being hauled around the Falls of St. Anthony, Fitzcarraldo style. She was built above the falls to run on the Mississippi up to St. Cloud, but when that business dropped off, the owner decided to try his luck downstream. It would have been a lot easier if there'd been locks, but they weren't built until the 1950s. Take a look at the building on the right with the arches and pillars on the first floor. It's still there on Old Main Street.